Whoever you are, whatever you are, however you got here, hello. Right, human psychology is one of my favourite topics, which means keeping this to around 20 minutes is going to be a challenge. So let's get straight into this with a thought experiment. Let's say you've died. Sorry about that. Dead. Now your soul is swept off to some heavenly departure lounge where an angel in an unnecessary uniform hands you a declaration card. There's only one question on this card, and it reads, Question 1. Thinking back on your life, recalling everything that you ever saw or experienced, approximately what proportion did you perceive with absolute clarity, free of deception, illusion, propensity, or persuasion? Here's a little music while you think this over. If you found this question difficult to answer, don't worry, you are in good company. Regarding how fallible our perceptions are may be impossible to judge without drawing on exactly the same cognitive biases that we're trying to assess. And in trying to answer the question on that declaration card, if we were aware of the mental shortcuts that our brain was taking to arrive at an answer, then how could we respond with any conviction? Just in case you ever find yourself in this situation, here's a guide to a few everyday tools that our brains use to skirt difficult questions. For this podcast, I'm going to be drawing inspiration from Daniel Kahneman's awesome book, Think Fast, Think Slow. Empirically and anecdotally, he exposes various methods our unconscious minds employ to ease the decision-making process. In most day-to-day cases, the solutions our minds come up with don't have to be rational or watertight, or even particularly accurate. They just need to help us reach a conclusion quickly. For example, imagine the question on that declaration card also had to be answered within a time limit. You now have 60 seconds to write your answer, or you'll be sent straight to hell. The sudden hike in urgency causes a reflexive shift from a well-reasoned and thought-out answer to a faster, more emotional and belief-based way of thinking called a heuristic. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that we use to ease problem solving and making probability judgments. These imperfect mental intuitions, inspired guesses, rules of thumb, sweeping generalizations, etc., they come to the rescue not only in high-pressure situations, but basically whenever an ideal solution is impossible or impractical. They certainly make decision-making easier for us in this way, but often the result is irrational or just false. Oh, and the first rule of using heuristics is you don't know that you're using a heuristic. Remember, this is all unconscious. Because social creatures often benefit by exploiting each other, there is a natural advantage if you can recognize when deception is occurring. Cheats and liars have evolved some cunning counter tricks to stay undetected. Self-deception may have evolved to hide the telltale signs of our own emotional counterfeiting. The fact that humans do fool themselves in order to manipulate others leaves individuals with the unshakable impression that they are better, kinder, more moral, and even smarter than the average person. Obviously, the entire population can't all be above average, in any respect. So the feeling that we ourselves hold no biases when making decisions, despite it being obviously human nature to do so, is itself an example of self-deception. A clue to understanding why we construct and believe false explanations for our own actions lies in the idea of cognitive dissonance. If you forgot to write that down last episode, write it down now. Cognitive dissonance describes the uncomfortable, even stressful feeling that arises from holding two incompatible beliefs, ideas, or values simultaneously. We saw in the last episode that when someone is confronted with plausible evidence that contradicts their views, they will reflexively attempt to minimize the psychological trauma. This effect can resolve in a few predictable ways. Imagine you have two competing desires. You like cake, but you also want to lose weight. Not all thought experiments need to be quite as hypothetical as the last one. A person stricken with this kind of cognitive dissonance might opt to change their behavior. I like cake, but I want to lose weight, so I'll stop eating cake. That's one option. Another is that they might try to justify their behavior by reasoning with themselves. I'm still allowed cake sometimes. They could retrofit a new clause by accommodating both ways of thinking simultaneously. I'll eat this cake, obviously, yum, but then I'll spend more time at the gym this afternoon. If all else fails, you can double down, stubbornly denying the inconvenient truth that you're faced with by rationalizing, carrot cake is actually quite good for me, could be worse. They might then duck and weave to avoid any contradictory evidence to this statement in the future. This would then be a full-blown confirmation bias. I should clarify here that cognitive dissonance itself is neither a mental bias or a heuristic. Instead, it leads to the emergence of self-deception via confirmation bias and the delusion that we're somehow bias-free. If we can't view the world with an unequivocal objectivity, perhaps we can at least grasp a few of the mechanisms by which we routinely deceive ourselves. First up, we have what's known as the bias bias, or the blind spot bias. This is, as we just discussed, the impression that we ourselves hold no biases. Think of all the advertisements that we're subjected to on TV, websites, bus stops, t-shirts, shopping bags, you name it. Thank goodness that we are not susceptible to all of this subliminal messaging. No. You have just been punked by the blind spot bias. We are all susceptible to unconscious persuasion. Even you, dear listener. Try to be more honest with yourself as you listen on. So to benefactance. This is the automatic willingness to take credit for success while denying responsibility for failure. Amusingly, this can actually be provoked. Participants in rigged games reliably attribute their success to skill and failures to bad luck. Understanding why we do this boils down to resolving cognitive dissonance. For example, people habitually doctor their beliefs to maintain the proposal, I am a nice person in complete control of my actions. Any evidence to the contrary doesn't feel good. It hits a nerve. To soothe our egos, fast drivers will claim that they have above average reflexes, while slow drivers will boast about above average attitudes to safety. In reality, these are all just stories we invent to resolve mental conflicts and present ourselves in the best possible light at all times. Such rationalizations often lead us to defend ideas or decisions purely because they were our choices. Benefactance is what creates brand loyalty, overconfidence, and loss aversion, which we'll get to in a moment. Next, we have confirmation bias, the desire to seek out, reference, interpret, and overvalue information that supports our prior beliefs. This trademark of human thinking is pervasive and subtle, irresistible yet egregious. Nobody knows quite why we do this. Maybe it's because an internal conflict is harder to resolve than simply discounting new information. Perhaps it's benefactance that blinds us to our own fallibility. Naturally, the more emotionally charged or deeply entrenched a belief is, the stronger our confirmation bias. Confirmation bias goes a long way to explaining why myths persevere so long after evidence has shown them to be false. Also, why we ignore the bad aspects of something or someone and focus only on the good. It also predicts that we would interpret ambiguous information as supporting our cause. This can lead people to draw some pretty shaky links between cause and effect. Sometimes it's like the Enlightenment never happened. Next, we have loss aversion. This describes the fact that people generally work so much harder to avoid a loss than they would to secure a gain. This can be beneficial, but it's not in any way logical. Let's play a game. A coin toss. Heads you win, tails you lose. But what do the stakes need to be for a person to want to take part? Experiments show that people must stand to win at least twice as much as they might lose before they will agree to a bet. Scaled up, loss aversion drives people to keep investing in terrible ideas, hoping that it will all pay off in the end. Sometimes accepting a sunk cost and walking away is the best thing that we can do. But every concession offends us. Loss aversion produces a fascinating array of human behaviors, like how people will often stake more to keep something than they would have paid for it in the first place. Overconfidence. We each operate under the impression that we are, to a significant degree, in control of our lives. The first problem with this arises from what Mr. Kahneman calls, "what you see is all there is." This is a pet name for something that seems quite obvious. Say you were planning a holiday and wanted to pack sensibly. Hopefully this isn't too taxing on your imagination. In this situation, a sensible thing to pack might be your passport. You know that to get through airports and border regulations, you'll need this documentation. And you know that you know this. This is a known known. You don't know if you should pack for wet weather or dry weather, so you pack clothes for both eventualities just in case. You know that you don't know what the weather will be like every day of your trip. This is a known unknown. However, and here's the rub, it's the things that you don't know that are rarely taken into account when planning. Sick passengers, delayed flights, losing your wallet, hotels overbooking, allergies to new foods, local customs you never thought to ask about until getting arrested. The list is practically infinite. Yet we always expect things to pan out according to our most optimistic plans. Overconfidence stems from how oblivious we are to the fact of unknown unknowns. When making any plans, we need to bear in mind that everything we see and can think of and remember and foretell is not all there is to take into consideration, and never will be. This brings us to the normative bias. The future does not always mirror the past. As well as cursing us with an illusion of control and the planning fallacy mentioned before, what you see is all there is may also be responsible for our bewilderingly inaccurate guesswork as a species. Just because something has never happened before doesn't mean that it never will. This is a cardinal sin when it comes to assessing potential risks. How is it that we constantly fail to appreciate how complex the world is, even though we know our grasp of reality is based on such a small and inescapably unrepresentative set of experiences? The mind just assumes that what's normal today will hold in the future, without respecting the role of chance. Again, by underestimating the chaotic nature of the universe, people overestimate how much control they possess. The heuristic that tomorrow will be much like today, and the future will be much like the past, makes our decisions regrettably, even fatally, over-optimistic. Availability, or how easy it is for us to think up examples, can also lead us astray. We all tend to inflate the significance of information that we already have. Are plane crashes a serious threat, or do they just secure a lot of media attention? It's always good to track where your opinions come from, if you can. Did you know that natural temperature fluctuations, choking, and falling down stairs kills vastly more people every year than air disasters? If this seems surprising, it's only because people make their decisions based on how easily information can be recalled, without consulting reliable statistics. The scores of everyday people who die tragically by choking on food rarely make it into the news. It's a bad heuristic, and a logical fallacy, to assume that the ease with which events spring to mind accurately reflects their likelihood. Not just events, but anything. It's effortless to list words that begin with the letter R. Very difficult to think of any with R as the third letter. I mean, you'll get a few if you think about it long enough. In a pinch, you might quickly conclude, therefore, that more words begin with the letter R, and you'd be wrong. In English, there are around 2.5 times more words where R appears as the third letter. Substitution is an absolute gem. This is when we exchange a very complicated question for a much simpler one in order to reach a decision quicker. It's difficult to know whether you should donate to charity, right? I mean, the prospect raises a lot of questions, like, will my money actually make a difference? Could it be better invested elsewhere? Do all contributions go towards that cause, or are others profiting somehow? It's a thorny issue and too much to properly consider when someone's shaking a tin at you in a shopping mall. So how about an easier question? Am I a nice person? Yes. Here are my bank details. Do you really think this person would make for an effective leader? Or did you vote for them because they're always dressed like a winner? Many of our life-changing decisions are made using this heuristic, from buying a new house to choosing who to go on a date with. Turning a complex question into a very simple one is why Tinder is so successful. It's critical to consider whether we're really answering the important question or an easier one that we've substituted. Anchoring, or being influenced by irrelevant numbers. We see this heuristic wherever we look for it. People adjust their beliefs around initial information, regardless of how arbitrary that information is. Asking people whether Gandhi was more or less than 114 years old when he died will provoke much older average guesses than if you were to ask if he was more or less than 35 years old. If I see that a TV in a shop has been reduced from $1,000 to $800, I'm bound to feel like I'm getting a better deal than if the same TV just had an $800 price tag. Even if it had recently gone up in price, I would still be paying $800, yet anchoring would taint my opinion. Economics show human behaviors to be influenced by meaningless environmental factors much more than we realize. Selective perception can cause us to overlook useful information, and we call this framing. It's when we focus our attention within a narrow frame of reference. Telling people that a product is 98% effective is the same as telling them that it fails 2% of the time, right? Explaining that 90% of patients survive a medical procedure is just like admitting that it carries a 10% mortality rate, yes? Not to a human. Framing information in a positive light improves our opinion, sways our decisions, and highlights how important it is to read things carefully. Fun fact, you can get more people to support your political policy if you talk in terms of employment rather than unemployment, even if both statements are equivalent. Humans. The illusion of explanatory depth, also known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the feeling that we know more about something than we actually do. I'm assuming that everybody listening to this knows how zippers work. But could you write it down? What about how soda streams work? How about ballpoint pens? Do you know how radios, sewing machines, crossbows, batteries work? These are all pretty everyday items, except for maybe crossbows, and most people would say they have a pretty good grasp of how they work. But we can reveal the embarrassing gap between what we know and what we think we know just by trying to explain our understanding to someone else. Asked to rate their knowledge of, say, refrigeration on a scale of 1 to 7, most people rate themselves pretty high. However, after outlining their understanding on paper, people always assess themselves less generously a second time. The confusion comes from distinguishing what we know from what others know. It sounds absurd, but the truth is, someone, somewhere, always knows how things work. We depend on the expertise of others to run our lives. Plumbers know how toilets work, and anyone can call a plumber. So the knowledge becomes practically diffuse within the community, and it feels like we must know about it ourselves. Estimating how deeply, coherently, and in how much detail we understand the world extends beyond technologies and applies to everything. Medicine, science, economics, climate change, human behavior, everything we are capable of misunderstanding. Those educated in a certain topic recognize how complex it really is and calibrate their confidence accordingly. challenging a layperson like myself to explain something they think they know forces them to confront the complexity and admit a higher degree of ignorance. Conversely, asking someone to merely give reasons for their opinion only incites hubris. And just like that, I've persuaded myself to shut up. If you love learning about people and finding out more about yourself and why we all do what we do, Danny Kaye's book that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode is the perfect crash course in all of these demonstrable economic facts. Among those I've mentioned, he also adds coherence, association, priming, effective forecasting, regression to the mean, and the peak-end rule, and yet more. It really is perspective-enhancing stuff. But why should any of this matter? If we're enslaved by cognitive biases and convenient heuristics, how does learning about them change anything? Here I'm reminded of the black market arms dealer from Tarantino's film Jackie Brown. When Ordell Robbie is asked why he keeps a self-interested, provocative, deceitful surfer gal around his illicit businesses, Ordell responds, "You can't trust Melanie, but you can always trust Melanie to be Melanie." This is a wonderful way to approach the human mind. If we're not aware of our biases and do not account for self-deception, we will fall towards irrational and unreasonable behaviours time and again. Only once we know our minds can we hope to do better. There we are, 20 minutes on the dot, just like I planned. I am brilliant. Next, we're going to look at opinions, which are things that just always seem to have passed me by.